The chairs were wrong. Not wrong in the way chairs are wrong when they are broken or uncomfortable or mismatched in a way that a room notices. Wrong in the way that an arrangement reveals an intention, and the intention revealed by the arrangement I had made was not the intention I wanted the room to communicate. I had placed the chairs in 2 rows facing each other, the way you place chairs for a negotiation, for a discussion between 2 parties who were across from each other in the formal sense. And what I wanted this meeting to be was not a negotiation between 2 parties, but a conversation between people who lived and worked in the same place and needed to understand each other's positions on something that affected all of them. I took the chairs apart. I rearranged them in a rough circle, the way chairs were arranged when what was wanted was not debate, but conversation. When the point was for everyone to see each other's faces rather than to see the faces of the people across from them and the backs of the heads of the people beside them. I added 2 more chairs to the circle because the first arrangement had not included chairs for David and Joy, who would be present. David as the operational manager of the restaurant, Joy as the head chef, and a person with specific knowledge of how the business functioned on a daily basis and what the specific implications of various changes to the neighborhood would be for that functioning. I stepped back from the circle of chairs and I looked at it in the Tuesday morning light, which was the particular light of a Tuesday in the 3rd week of September in Houston, which was still warm but was beginning to acknowledge that warmth would not last indefinitely, that the calendar had a direction, even in a city that argued with the calendar more convincingly than most cities. The meeting was at 10. It was 7:45. My name is Patience Adeyemi. I am 55 years old. I have been running a restaurant in 3rd Ward, Houston for 22 years. And in those 22 years, I have arranged chairs in this dining room for 100 different purposes. For birthday parties and anniversary dinners and neighborhood gatherings and the occasional event that required a temporary rearrangement of the usual furniture. The retirement party of a woman who had eaten here every Tuesday for 14 years. The graduation celebration of a young man whose grandmother had told me about his acceptance letter before he told anyone else. The annual dinner of a church group whose members ranged in age from 9 to 91. I had arranged chairs in this room for all of those occasions, and I had never, in all of those arrangements, spent this much time thinking about what the arrangement communicated. But this was not a birthday party. This was a conversation that would determine, or help determine, or at minimum inform the determination of what happened to the rezoning proposal that Marcus Webb had advanced from committee in June. And what happened to that proposal would determine in significant part what happened to this block and the businesses on it over the next 10 years. And what happened to this block over the next 10 years would determine in significant part whether the things I had spent 22 years building would still be standing when Joy was my age and Keisha was Joy's age, and whoever was learning from Keisha at that point was 22 years old and beginning. The stakes of the arrangement of chairs were, therefore, higher than the stakes of most chair arrangements. I went to the kitchen. I made coffee. I did not make the restaurant coffee. I made the personal coffee, the specific preparation I had learned from my mother's version of it, which was stronger and darker than what the restaurant served, and which I made only for myself and occasionally for people who I was having the kind of conversation that required it. I had made it for Yvonne on Monday when she came to talk about the legal landscape before today's meeting. I had made it for myself the morning after Marcus died, when I had returned to the kitchen at 5 a.m. because there was nowhere else to be. I was making it now because today's meeting was the kind of meeting that required it. I want to tell you about Monday afternoon with Yvonne before I tell you about Tuesday morning, because Monday afternoon was the preparation for Tuesday morning, and you cannot fully understand the meeting without understanding the preparation for it. Yvonne had come at 2 o'clock, not to the restaurant, to her office, which was where we met when the meeting was about law rather than about life, when what we needed was the specific environment of her professional space rather than my domestic professional space, the conference table and the filing cabinets and the organized shelves of case documents that constituted the physical expression of 22 years of her particular expertise. I had been in that office more times than I could count, had learned to read the room through Yvonne's arrangement of the materials on her desk, which told me, when they were orderly, that she had prepared for the meeting and had a clear direction, and when they were slightly more dispersed, that she was working through something that had not yet resolved into clarity. On Monday, the desk was orderly. "The rezoning proposal," she said, when I had sat down and the coffee was poured, "is technically at the committee approval stage, which means it has been approved for advancement to the full council, but has not yet been voted on by the full council. The full council vote is scheduled for the second Tuesday of October, which is 3 weeks from now." 3 weeks, I said. 3 weeks, she confirmed. In those 3 weeks, there are 2 things that could change the outcome. The first is that the full council members who have not yet publicly committed to a position could be influenced by community input, by meetings, by constituent contacts, by the specific kind of direct communication from affected residents and business owners that council members take seriously when it comes to a vote. The second is that the district representative himself could modify his support for the proposal, which would almost certainly change the outcome, because, as I told you before, the full council tends to defer to the district representative on zoning matters in their district. Marcus Webb could change his position, I said. He could modify it, Yvonne said. Not necessarily reverse it entirely, but modify the proposal itself. Recommend amendments that would protect existing businesses, that would require impact assessments, that would include community benefit provisions. These kinds of modifications are common in rezoning situations that have significant community opposition. They are how a politician manages to support development interests while also maintaining credibility with constituents who are concerned about displacement. "Is that what you think will happen?" I said. Yvonne looked at me with the specific expression she had when I asked her a question that was more about what she thought than about what she knew, and when she was deciding how much of what she thought to share. "I think," she said carefully, "that Marcus Webb is a politician who is 4 years into his first term and is running for re-election. He is not an ideologue. He does not have a single issue that defines his political identity. He is a pragmatist who has made decisions based on his assessment of what was politically viable, and his assessment of what was politically viable with regard to the rezoning proposal was shaped by the information he had when he made the advancement vote, which did not include a recording of a conversation in his constituent's restaurant that was published in the Houston Chronicle. The recording changed his calculation, I said. The recording made visible the specific tension between his community preservation language and his advancement vote, Yvonne said. That tension existed before the recording. The recording made it exist publicly. That is a different kind of pressure from the kind that lobby groups and development companies apply in private, which is what he had been experiencing before the photograph session. She paused. "I think he will come to the meeting tomorrow," she said. "I think he will listen in the meeting tomorrow. Whether he will act on what he hears, that I cannot tell you." because it depends on factors that are not in the room tomorrow, which include the amount of pressure he is receiving from the development interests that supported the proposal and the calculation he makes about which pressure is ultimately more consequential for his reelection. What can we do in the room tomorrow that makes the calculation go in our direction? I said. Be specific, she said. Not emotional, not general, specific. He has heard community concern about displacement in the abstract. He has not heard, from the people most directly affected, the specific numbers. What it would cost to relocate. What the neighborhood would lose in terms of years of business and community relationship and the specific services that these businesses provide. What the block looks like without the dry cleaner who has been there since 1987 and without the barbershop where people have been getting haircuts for 18 years, and without the restaurant where, she paused, where a woman who came from Lagos with $40 has been cooking for 22 years. She looked at me. Tell him the specific story, she said, not the general story of community and belonging and the importance of preserving neighborhood character. Those things are true, and he has heard them. Tell him what happens to the specific human beings at the specific table where he is sitting on the specific morning when the rezoning passes and the developer acquires the properties. I thought about this. He may already know, I said. He may have made the calculation and decided it was acceptable.
He may have, Yvonne said. But there is a difference between a calculation made with abstract information and a calculation made with specific human information. People can accept abstract sacrifices that they cannot accept specific ones. The specific is harder to dismiss. She reached into the folder on her desk and withdrew a document. I prepared something, she said. It's not for you to distribute at the meeting. It's for you to have as reference material. It's a summary of the rezoning proposal's specific provisions, what they would allow, and what the realistic development scenario looks like if the proposal passes, including the timeline. Development companies in Houston, once they have zoning approval, typically move within 18 months, which means the businesses on your block would likely be receiving acquisition offers within a year of the council vote. I took the document. I read the relevant sections. I put it in my bag. Yvonne, I said when I had finished reading. Yes, if the proposal passes as written, is there any legal mechanism for the existing businesses to challenge it? There are mechanisms, she said. They are difficult and expensive and rarely successful because zoning decisions are within the council's authority and the standard for judicial review is deferential to legislative judgment. The better mechanisms are political, not legal. Amendments to the proposal, community benefit agreements with the developer, preservation ordinances that protect specific structures. These are the things that are achievable, but they require the political will of the district representative to pursue. Which brings us back to Marcus Webb, I said. Which brings us back to Marcus Webb, she agreed. I drove back to the restaurant from Yvonne's office, and I spent the evening in the usual way, working the dinner service with the usual attention. The attention that the service required, regardless of what was happening in the day around it. The specific quality of focus that a working kitchen demanded, and that I had given it every evening for 22 years, and that I gave it now, this September Monday, with a meeting scheduled for Tuesday morning, and a legal summary in my bag, and the knowledge of what would happen in 18 months if certain things did not change. After the dinner service, I sat in booth number 4. This is something I had been doing for a long time,
and something I will probably continue to do until I stop being the person who runs this restaurant, which I hope will not be for a long time yet.
I sat in booth number 4, alone, with the dining room quiet around me, and the kitchen cleaned, and the staff gone home, and the building doing its overnight settling sounds. And I thought about the meeting. I thought about what Yvonne had said. Be specific. I thought about what specific meant in the context of this meeting, which was not the same as what specific meant in the context of a legal document or a journalist's article. Specific in a meeting meant the specific human beings who would be in the room tomorrow, not as abstractions or as examples or as representatives of a category, but as themselves, with their particular histories and their particular relationships to the places they worked in. I thought about Mr. Park. He had been running the dry cleaner 2 doors down since 1989. 35 years, which was longer than I had been in this country. He had come from South Korea, had built his business with his family, had sent 3 children through college on the proceeds of cleaning other people's clothes with an exactness and a care that I had always admired from a distance. He had declined 2 previous development approaches, which told me he understood the stakes of those approaches and had made his decision with clear information. He had joined the coalition after the health inspection situation, which told me he understood that his individual refusal was insufficient and that collective action was necessary. He had survived 35 years on this block. He had survived the various shifts and changes and pressures that a neighborhood went through over 35 years of continuous change. And he had done this not by being flexible in the sense of accommodating, but by being flexible in the sense of adaptable, by finding the way to continue to be relevant and necessary to the neighborhood, even as the neighborhood changed around him. He was not a relic. He was a person who understood what his business was for and had continued to make it for that purpose across changes that would have made a less committed person give up.
I thought about Jerome. His barbershop had been on the corner for 18 years. It was not simply a barbershop in the sense that the word was usually used. It was the specific kind of place that some communities produced and others did not, where the work that happened in the chairs was accompanied by the work that happened in the conversation, where the people who came in for a haircut left having been in the specific company of their neighborhood, in a way that the haircut was almost incidental to.
I had been in Jerome's shop once, years ago, when David had needed a haircut and the usual barber had been unavailable, and I had understood immediately from the way the room worked, from the simultaneous conversations happening at different chairs, from the specific quality of the attention that the people in the room paid to each other, that this was a place that served a function in its neighborhood that a different kind of haircut establishment in a different kind of neighborhood could not replace. What would happen to the people who went to Jerome's shop if Jerome's shop was gone? Where would they go? Not just for the haircut, for the conversation, for the specific experience of being in a room with people who knew them and who expected to see them and who talked to them about their lives in the way that you could only talk to people who had been in the same room with you regularly for 18 years.
This was the specific thing that Yvonne was asking me to put in the room tomorrow. Not the sentiment, the specific human function that would be lost, irreplaceable and unquantifiable, and therefore never appearing in the developer's impact assessment. I thought about Maria and Rosa, the alteration shop. 23 years, started by their mother, taken over by them. The specific intimacy of an alteration shop, which was different from any other kind of commerce. The alteration shop required the customer to stand in a fitting room while someone measured them, required a relationship of trust and physical proximity that was unlike the relationship you had with the person who brought your food or cleaned your clothes. The people who came to Maria and Rosa's shop had been trusting them with their bodies for 23 years. The specific vulnerability of standing in a small room while someone with measuring tape and pins and the knowledge of how to make clothes fit correctly worked with what was there rather than with what was ideal. When a person who had been coming to Maria and Rosa for 23 years moved or changed their life in ways that took them away from Third Ward, they often found that finding a new alteration shop was more difficult than finding a new restaurant or a new dry cleaner, because the specific knowledge of their particular body that Maria and Rosa had accumulated over 23 years was not easily transferable to a new person who would have to start from the beginning. The knowledge lived in Maria and Rosa's hands and in the files they kept of each customer's specific measurements and preferences. It was knowledge that had been built over years and that served its customers better the longer it existed. I sat in booth number 4, and I thought about all of this for a long time. I thought about it not to prepare a speech. I was not a speech person, had never been comfortable with the prepared statement delivered for effect, had always believed that prepared statements were less honest than honest conversation because they were shaped by the audience's anticipated reaction rather than by the speaker's actual thought. I thought about it to understand what was true, so that when I was in the room tomorrow with Marcus Webb, I would know what was true and could speak from it. What was true was simple, in the way that simple things were sometimes difficult to say, because their simplicity made them sound like sentiment rather than like fact. The businesses on this block had been in this neighborhood for decades, had been in this neighborhood before the neighborhood became interesting to developers, had built the neighborhood's character rather than benefited from it, had spent 20 and 30 years making a place that other people now wanted to be in. And the proposal that had been advanced would give those other people the opportunity to be in a place that no longer contained the people who had made it. This was not a new story. It was the oldest story of urban development. The story that had been told in neighborhoods across every American city that had experienced this cycle. It was not unique to Houston or to Third Ward. It was so common as to have a name and a vocabulary and an academic literature and a community of advocates who had been fighting it for decades. What was unique was this specific block, this specific community, these specific people, on this specific Tuesday morning in September. The Tuesday morning arrived. I had been at the restaurant since 6:30, not because the meeting required my presence at 6:30. The meeting was at 10, and the preparation for the meeting was largely done. The chairs arranged, the coffee prepared, the documentation in my bag. I had come at 6:30 because coming early to the restaurant was what I did when something important was going to happen in it. It was, I had come to understand over 22 years, a form of the same instinct that led me to arrive at a room before the person I was meeting, to be present in a space before the event that was going to happen in the space, to have time to feel what the space was before the event changed what it was. The restaurant in the early morning was its fullest self in a particular way, not the self of the dinner service, which was its fullest self in a different way, but the self that existed before the day had asked it to be anything specific, when it was simply the building with its 22 years of use in it,
the photographs and the tables and the booth by the window and the kitchen behind the pass. I made the specific coffee at 6:45. I sat in booth number 4 with the coffee, and I waited for the morning to do what mornings did, which was to establish themselves as the particular morning they were going to be. At 7:15, Joy arrived. She had known about the meeting since Thursday. I had told her after the politician's visit, had described the question and the response and the agreement to meet. She had listened with the specific attention she brought to things that mattered and had said, "I want to be there." I had said, "I thought you would." She came through the kitchen, assessed the state of the morning prep, added 2 items to the list that she wanted the morning cooks to have ready before they left for the day, and came out through the pass into the dining room. She stood in the circle of chairs. She looked at the arrangement. "You changed it," she said. "From what?" I said. "I don't know what from," she said, "but this looks like a conversation rather than a meeting." The first version must have looked more like a meeting. I looked at my daughter, who had not been in the building when I arranged and rearranged the chairs at 7:45 this morning. "How do you know I changed it?" I said. "Because this is the version you would land on," she said, "not the first version." She went back to the kitchen. Mr. Park arrived at 9:15. He came in through the front door, which he always used. He had been a customer here before he was a colleague in the coalition, had eaten here regularly, had sat at various tables over the years with his wife and occasionally his adult children. The kind of customer who came with a consistency that told you the restaurant was part of the regular structure of his life rather than an occasional visit. He shook my hand with both of his, which was his greeting and had always been his greeting, and which communicated, in its specific double-handed quality, the combination of warmth and formality that was his characteristic way of being in a room.
He sat in one of the circle chairs with the ease of someone who had been in many rooms where important things were discussed, who had learned over 35 years of business in a neighborhood that had experienced more than one cycle of change, how to be present in a difficult conversation without being consumed by the difficulty of it. He had brought nothing with him, no documents, no prepared materials, and I understood this as a statement about his approach, which was to bring himself rather than his paperwork. "Do you think he'll actually change anything?" he said. He said it without preamble, the directness of a man who had spent 35 years in the same place and had earned the right to not perform the approach to a subject. "I don't know," I said. "I think he heard something on Wednesday that he hadn't heard before. Whether hearing it is enough to produce a change is something I can't assess without being inside his calculation." Mr. Park nodded slowly. "I've dealt with politicians for 35 years, he said. They are not all the same. Some of them are captured. They made their calculation before they walked in the door, and nothing you say will change it. Some of them are genuinely uncertain and are looking for something that will help them make the calculation. And some of them, not many, but some, are people who have made a decision they believe in and can be shown, with the right information, why the decision was wrong." "Which do you think Webb is?" I said. "I don't know," he said. "But the fact that he came suggests he is not entirely captured. A captured politician doesn't risk a meeting where the constituent has a camera." Jerome arrived at 9:25.
He was wearing what he wore when he was making a presentation of himself, rather than simply going about his business, which was a dark jacket over his usual work clothes. The kind of jacket that said, "I am aware that this is an occasion," without saying that I am someone who requires an occasion to be present. He greeted Mr. Park with the specific warmth of two men who had been neighbors for years and had become colleagues through adversity, and he sat down in the circle with the quality of someone who was comfortable in his own body in a way that came not from certainty about the outcome, but from the certainty of his own position. "Does he know what we're going to say?" Jerome said. "He knows we're going to say something," I said. "He doesn't know exactly what." "Good," Jerome said.
I want to see his face when Maria tells him about the couple who have been bringing their clothes in for alterations for 20 years and who she still knows by the specific way his wife's left shoulder is slightly lower than her right, and how the hem on her skirts needs to compensate for it. "She's going to tell that story?" I said. "She's been practicing it since Thursday," he said. "Rosa says she's told it 4 times already." Maria and Rosa arrived together at 9:30. They came in with the specific energy of people who had prepared for something and were ready for it. The energy of preparation that had not curdled into anxiety, but had remained as readiness, which was the healthy version of the same thing. Maria was carrying a folder, which told me she had brought documentation. I had told them at the coalition meeting that documentation was not required, that we were having a conversation rather than presenting a case. But Maria had brought a folder, and I understood this as her version of preparation and did not try to redirect it. They sat down. Rosa looked at the circle of chairs and said something to Maria in Spanish that I did not hear fully, but that had the quality of approval. David arrived at 9:45. He sat down in the chair that had been placed near the kitchen door, the operational position, the position from which he could observe the room and manage whatever needed to be managed without being at the center of the conversation. He had his laptop, which told me he was prepared to take notes if notes were useful, which was a role I had not asked him to take, but that was, as I looked at it, exactly the right role for him. Joy came out of the kitchen at 9:50. She sat down in the remaining chair, between Maria and the space I had left near the front for Webb and whoever he was bringing with him. The circle was almost complete. Webb arrived at 10:03. He came with 2 people, the woman with the tablet from the advance team, who was apparently a permanent part of his operation and not simply a campaign event specialist, and the man I had not seen before, who introduced himself as his policy director, which was the person in a council member's office whose job was to understand the specifics of proposals well enough to advise the council member on their implications. The policy director's presence was itself a piece of information. You brought a policy director to a meeting when you were taking the meeting seriously as a substantive engagement rather than as a community relations exercise. The woman with the tablet was the community relations side. The policy director was the substance side. Both of them being here meant, potentially, that Webb intended both. I introduced everyone.
Webb shook hands with each person individually, with the practiced warmth of someone who had learned to make handshakes feel personal, even when there were several of them in sequence. He sat down in the chair I had left for him. His staff sat on either side. "Thank you for agreeing to this meeting," he said. "I want to start by acknowledging that the question Patience asked on Wednesday was a legitimate question and that I should have been able to give a more complete answer than I gave. I'm here to give the more complete answer." He said this directly, without elaborate setup, which I noted. The directness was either genuine or well-practiced enough to be indistinguishable from genuine, and in either case, it was the correct approach, because it moved us past the preliminary establishment of positions that would have been necessary if he had come in defensively. I'd like to hear from the business owners first, I said, their specific situations, and then I'd like to talk about the proposal. He nodded. Mr. Park spoke first. He spoke in the precise, economical English of someone who had been speaking it for 35 years and had learned to express what he meant without excess. He described the dry cleaner, the years, the family, the specific relationship with the neighborhood. He described what the business was for its customers, which was not only the cleaning of clothes, but the specific service of someone who had been trusted with the objects that mattered, the wedding dresses, the suits worn to funerals, the everyday items that accumulated the texture of a life. He said, "When my regular customers bring me something, they are trusting me with something that is difficult to replace. They are not trusting me because I am the nearest dry cleaner. They are trusting me because I have been here long enough for them to have decided that I can be trusted. That trust took 35 years to build. It cannot be built again in a new location in a year." Webb listened. He did not take notes. His policy director did, and he looked at Mr. Park with the quality of attention that was either genuine listening or the performance of genuine listening. And the difference between those two things was something I could not determine from the outside. Jerome spoke next. He was more expansive than Mr. Park, more comfortable with narrative, which was appropriate because his business was more conversational than the dry cleaner, more embedded in the ongoing story of its customers' lives, rather than in the discrete transactions of bringing and retrieving. He described the barbershop as a place where the cutting of hair was the occasion for a kind of gathering that served a function in the neighborhood that could not be identified in a business registration, but that was as real as the lease. He said, "When you develop this block, and I am no longer on that corner, the people who have been coming to my shop for 18 years will find another barber. What they will not find is the specific room where they have been talking to each other for 18 years. That room does not exist anywhere else. It only exists because we have been building it for 18 years, every Saturday morning, one conversation at a time." Webb looked at Jerome for a moment after he finished, and I saw something in his expression that was not calculation, or not primarily calculation. It was the expression of a person receiving specific information that had changed the texture of something they had understood in abstract terms. Maria spoke last. She spoke, as Jerome had predicted, about the couple with the altered skirts. She described them by the specific challenge of the left shoulder, the hem calculation, the 20 years of knowing this specific body and what this specific body needed from the clothes it wore. She described what it would mean, practically, for this couple to find a new alteration shop after 20 years. The relearning, the remeasuring, the period of clothing that did not fit quite right because the new person had not yet understood what the previous person had understood. She said, "The knowledge of my customers' bodies is not knowledge that exists anywhere else. It is knowledge that exists between us, built over 20 years of work. If I close, that knowledge disappears. They lose not only the place they come to, they lose the relationship that made the place useful." Webb was quiet for a moment after Maria finished. Then he said, "I want to tell you something about the advancement vote." I waited. The advancement vote was the correct procedural response to a proposal that had been properly submitted and that had gone through the appropriate committee process, he said. "I want to be clear about that because I don't want to claim that I made a procedural error. The procedural decision was correct." A pause. I could feel the room holding itself in the pause, waiting for what came after the procedural defense. "What I did not do adequately," he said, "before the advancement vote, was what I have been doing for the past 20 minutes. I did not sit in a room with the specific people whose specific lives would be affected by the specific provisions of this proposal and understand what those provisions would mean for those specific people. He looked around the circle. Not the political scan, the real look. I relied on the planning committee's process, he said, which consulted with stakeholder groups in the general sense: environmental impact, housing impact, transit impact. The committee's process does not have a mechanism for what you three just did, which is to tell me specifically what 35 years of building a dry cleaner looks like from the inside and what it would mean to lose it. Is that an omission in the process or in the proposal? Joy said. Webb looked at Joy. He had not been formally introduced to Joy. She had come in and sat down and had not been identified specifically, and I had not corrected this because I was curious how he would engage with her, a woman who spoke from the kitchen rather than from the business ownership. "Who are you?" he said, not rudely, genuinely. "I run the kitchen," Joy said. "I'm her daughter." "An omission in both," he said, answering her question. "The process should have included this kind of conversation, and the proposal, as written, does not adequately protect the interests of established businesses in the corridor." The policy director looked up from his notes. The woman with the tablet had stopped scrolling. "What does adequately protect mean?" I said, "in the context of this specific proposal?" Webb's policy director said, "May I?" Webb nodded. The policy director was a compact man in his early 30s, with the specific bearing of someone who had gone into policy work rather than political work because he was more interested in the substance than the performance, which was a particular kind of intelligence that was different from the kind required for electoral politics and that produced different kinds of people. He said, "The proposal in its current form allows development by right in the newly designated zones, meaning no additional approvals are required beyond the standard permitting. To protect existing businesses, you would need either a grandfather clause that exempts currently operating businesses from the provisions, or a community benefit agreement that requires any development project to provide relocation assistance and right of return, or an amendment to the proposal that creates a transition period of sufficient length to allow existing businesses to adapt." "Which of those is achievable?" I said. "All three are technically achievable," he said. "The question is whether there is council support for any of them." "Is there?" I said. He looked at Webb. Webb said, "I don't know yet. What I know is that I'm going to find out. And I know that finding out requires me to have conversations that I have not been having, which is conversations with the specific people whose specific situations will be affected, rather than with the interest groups that brought me the proposal." I looked at him. "What changed?" I said. "Between the advancement vote in June and this conversation?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the practiced pause, the genuine one.
"The question you asked on Wednesday changed it," he said. "Not because the question was new information. Because it was asked publicly, in your restaurant, in front of a camera, by a person who has been in this neighborhood for 22 years and who was not performing concern, but was simply asking the thing that needed to be asked." He looked at me across the circle of chairs. "I have received a great deal of communication about this proposal," he said. "From development interests, from advocacy groups, from community organizations. All of it is abstract. All of it is about categories of people and general principles and broad impacts. Your question was about a specific building, on a specific block, in a specific neighborhood. And it was asked by a specific person who has been in that building for 22 years. He paused. "The specific is harder to dismiss," he said.
I recognized the phrase. It was the phrase Yvonne had used on Monday afternoon, across her orderly desk with the coffee I had made from the personal preparation rather than the restaurant preparation. The specific is harder to dismiss. I had not told Webb what Yvonne had said.
He had arrived at the same phrase independently, which told me that the phrase described something that was genuinely true about how human attention worked in the presence of specific information, rather than something that was a strategy for managing a politician. "Tell me what you need from this meeting," Webb said. "Not in general terms, specifically." I looked at Mr. Park. He was looking at me. I looked at Jerome. He was watching Webb with the specific attention of someone who was still deciding whether the thing he was watching was real. I looked at Maria, who had her folder in her lap and had not opened it, and whose expression was the expression of someone who had told her story and was now waiting to see what was done with it. "We need an amendment to the proposal," I said.
A community benefit provision that requires any development project in the newly designated zone to provide displaced businesses with relocation assistance, a right of first refusal on commercial space in the new development at pre-development rates, and a minimum 3-year transition period before any acquired property can be redeveloped. Webb's policy director was writing, "And we need you to bring us into the conversation before the council vote," I said. "Not as stakeholders in a process that has already made its determination, as people whose specific knowledge of this neighborhood is part of the information the council has when it votes." "A presentation before the full council?" Webb said. "A conversation," I said. "The same kind we are having now, with the other council members whose votes matter." Webb was quiet for a moment. "I can't promise what the other council members will do," he said. "I can commit to supporting the amendment."
"And I can commit to facilitating the conversation." He looked around the circle. "I want to be honest with you," he said. "The development interests that brought this proposal have resources and relationships that this conversation will not overcome entirely. They will push back on every amendment. The final form of the proposal that goes to a vote may not be everything you are describing, but it can be better than it is now, and it can include protections that recognize the specific interests of the specific businesses that are here." Jerome said, "Can you put in writing what you just said? Your commitment to the amendment and the conversation?" Webb looked at Jerome. "Yes," he said. Jerome nodded once, the nod of a man who has heard what he needed to hear and is deciding whether he believes it. The meeting ended at 11:47.
Not abruptly. It concluded in the natural way that productive meetings concluded, the way that meetings where real things had been said and received concluded, with the sense that the conversation had reached a point of temporary rest, rather than a point of resolution. The things that had been said were real. What would be done with them was not yet determined. Webb shook hands again with each person, the same double circuit of handshakes, but different from the arrival handshakes, in a way that I could feel but not precisely describe. The arrival handshakes had been the handshakes of someone performing the gesture. The departure handshakes were the handshakes of someone who had sat in a room and received specific information about specific people and was leaving with that information. His policy director confirmed that the written commitment would be sent to David by end of business on Thursday. They left. The room, after they left, had the specific quality of rooms after important conversations have happened in them. Not empty, because the conversation was still present in some sense, still occupying the space that it had occupied while it was happening, but no longer being generated. What had been said was now the material to work with. Mr. Park, Jerome, Maria, and Rosa stayed for a while.
We sat in the circle of chairs that I had spent 45 minutes arranging and rearranging at 7:45 in the morning, and we talked. Not about the meeting. We had been in the meeting. We had all heard and said the things that had been heard and said. But about the neighborhood, about the things that had led each of us to this street and had kept us here through the changes that the street had experienced. It was the conversation that the meeting had made possible, rather than the conversation of the meeting itself. The conversation that happened after the formal exchange, when people who had been formal with each other discovered that the formality was not the necessary condition of being together. Mr. Park told a story about the first winter he had been in Houston, which was December of 1989, which was the year he had opened the dry cleaner. He had expected cold.
He had not expected the specific quality of Houston cold, which was not the cold of most other places, and which had confused him in the specific way that expected things always confuse you more when they arrive in an unexpected form. He had called his wife's mother in Seoul and described it, and she had said, "That is not cold. That is merely the absence of warmth. I want you to be careful of the absence of warmth. It is more dangerous than the cold, because you do not know to prepare for it." Jerome said, "My grandmother used to say something similar about loneliness. She said loneliness is not the absence of people. It is the absence of the specific people. You can be surrounded by people and be lonely if they are not the specific people." I looked around the circle at the specific people. After Mr. Park and Jerome and Maria and Rosa had gone, and after David had gone to follow up on the policy director's commitment, and Joy had gone back to the afternoon prep, I sat in the empty dining room alone. I sat in booth number 4. The lunch service had not happened today. We had closed the restaurant to the public for the morning meeting, which I had not announced as a closure, but had simply managed through the reservation system. The restaurant would reopen for the dinner service at 5, and the dinner service would be what it always was, the full and usual version of the restaurant's purpose expressed in the specific language of food and service and the presence of people in a room that was made for their presence. But for the next hour it was mine, the quiet version, the version that was most itself. I sat in booth number 4, and I thought about what had happened, about the circle of chairs and the people who had sat in them, and the things they had said, and the specific information that had moved from the people who had been holding it for years to a person who had not previously received it in this specific form.
I thought about whether what had been said would change anything. I did not know. The written commitment would arrive or it would not. The amendment would be proposed or it would not. The council vote would include protections for existing businesses or it would not. All of these things were beyond the room, beyond my ability to determine, in the territory of outcomes that followed from conversations but were not contained by them. What I knew was what had been in the room.
What I knew was that Mr. Park had described 35 years of building trust in a specific place, and Jerome had described the specific room that had been built through 18 years of Saturday conversations, and Maria had described the specific knowledge of a specific body that had been built over 20 years of shared work. And I had described a building on a block in a neighborhood in a city where a woman had arrived with $40 and had spent 22 years building something that was not only hers. All of that had been in the room. All of that was now part of the information that a politician and his policy director carried away from Patience's table on a Tuesday morning in September. Whether they would use it correctly was not something I could determine. What I could determine was whether it had been said correctly, whether the specific had been made specific enough, whether the human had been made human enough. I thought it had.
The full council vote was in 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, the proposal would either be amended or not amended, would either include protections or not include protections, and the result of that vote would either change the conditions under which Mr. Park and Jerome and Maria and I continued to operate on this block, or not change them. In 3 weeks, I would know. Until then, the restaurant would be open. The jollof rice would be on the menu. The agusi would be on the specials board. Keisha would be at the prep station, learning the spice blends. Thomas would be working the floor. Joy would be in the kitchen, doing what Joy did in the kitchen, which was everything it required. And the booth number 4 would be here, the way it was always here, for whatever the next honest conversation was going to be. I was not done. I had not expected to be done.
22 years had taught me that done was not a state that applied to things that were alive, that things that were alive were always in the middle of something, that the middle was the whole of it, that what you built was always in the process of being built and defended and passed along. 3 weeks. That is my story this time. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is put the right people in the right room and ask the right questions, and let the specific be specific enough to do its work. The work is not done. It is never done. But the room had the right people in it, and the right things were said. And now we wait to see what the saying produces. I will see you in the next one.